Welcome to St. Thomas Church, Fifth Avenue, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, and especially to this lecture this morning, where we welcome back Kitty Harvey, someone who I am reminded by her mother was baptized and confirmed here, confirmed by a Bishop of Perth and baptized by John Andrew, a rector. Yes, you are here to speak to us about a lot of things, but specifically your perspective on the Sunni-Shia conflict in the Middle East, which you have written an extraordinary book about, which will be available for sale right now after this little talk, this lecture, and available via Venmo or cash, but down after the 11 a.m. service in the coffee hour time, where there'll be an opportunity to have her book signed. And in this discussion, she'll be talking about her book, but also specifically the theological origin of between the Sunni and Shia Islam and how that manifests today. And she'll also examine all of the waves of secularization that have happened not only across the globe, but in that region over the past 40 years, and what that means, especially since the 1979 Iranian Revolution, and we'll address the prospects for reconciliation today. I mentioned your baptism, I mentioned your confirmation. You're an adjunct professor in the Securities Studies program at Georgetown, where you teach classes on military strategy and Persian Gulf security. You hold a PhD in Middle Eastern Studies from King's College London, and you're the author of this book, A Self-Fulfilling Prophecy, The Saudis' Struggle for Iraq, published by Oxford University Press last year, which it looks at the relations between Iraq and Saudi Arabia in the years after the invasion of Iraq by the United States in 2003. And her other writing on the Middle East has appeared in the Washington Post, Lawfare, Brookings Order from Chaos, and other publications. You're a U.S. Navy veteran, and you've served as an intelligence officer aboard USS Wasp, an amphibious assault ship, as well as ashore in the Middle East and Europe. You're a graduate of the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, and you're now a member of their board of advisors. And we warmly welcome you this morning.
Thank you, everybody. Funnily enough, a little anecdote. You can tell that I have a sort of this security studies background, and probably this group does not have many. There are relatively few kind of theological and security studies overlap. But when I started my PhD at King's College London some years ago, I studied in the Middle Eastern Studies, kind of what became the Middle Eastern Studies department. And that department kind of bounced around a little bit. And it started in war studies. King's College London has a war studies department. And the Middle East Studies department started in war studies. And then it got spun off and joined the theological and religious studies department. and both kind of made sense. But there are only so many subjects that kind of fit both into war studies and into theology. But there you have it. And my thank you to Father Moritz for that very kind introduction. I'm delighted to be here. St. Thomas still feels very much like my home parish, just given all of the familial ties and personal ties. So I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted that to have people turn out to hear what I'm going to be talking about this morning, and I'm delighted to have an opportunity to sell my book. You are welcome to purchase the book. You're also welcome not to purchase the book, but I'm delighted to be here. And so just to give you a little background, my interest is really on kind of foreign policy of these various different countries and kind of the international relations of these various different countries. And what the book is really about is about relations between Iraq and Saudi Arabia in the years after the 2003 invasion of Iraq. And I bring that up because the 2003 invasion of Iraq, long story very short, I'll be discussing it a little bit in this, what had been a Sunni Arab regime became a government that was led by Shia Arabs. And the Saudi powers that be, who are Sunni, really were very wary of this new Iraq and sort of refused to engage with it for a very long time. And that's what I was exploring, and what I explore in my research and in this book is these relations between what became really a Sunni-dominated country and a Shia-dominated country and its Sunni neighbor. I am not going to be talking specifically about the book today. What I thought that I would do is, give you a little, you kind of take a couple of steps back and talk to you more broadly about Sunni and Shia Islam, and kind of give you an introduction, as Father Moritz mentioned, about kind of these issues, the origin of the split, and the kind of the ramifications today. So, okay, with that in mind, I've divided this talk into 3 parts. First, I will give you a basic overview into relations between Sunnis and Shia. Second, I'm going to be addressing why these sectarian identities became so inflamed in the last 40 years, in contrast to many commentators who erroneously paint Sunnis and Shia as sort of perpetually at each other's throats. The sectarian conflict that took root in the last 40 years was really the result of specific events and circumstances in the region. Fortunately, these tensions have receded substantially in recent years, and that will be my third and final point. There have definitely been moments of significant tension in the relations between Sunnis and Shia, across the broad sweep of the last 1400 years of Islamic history. But for most of that vast period, Sunnis and Shia have coexisted peacefully. The rise of ISIS about a decade ago marked the high point in Sunni-Shia tensions in recent years. But fortunately today, what we are witnessing in the region, very fortunately, is a reversion to the norm, which is just banal coexistence. The overview of Sunni-Shia relations. And before anything else, let's address some basic concepts. Sunni and Shia Islam are the 2 major sects of the Islamic faith. That said, Sunni and Shia Islam are not uniform categories. Both sects are diverse, with a multitude of divergent strains. There is no monolithic Sunni or monolithic Shia. Within Shia Islam, there is, however, a predominant strain, Twelver Shiism, which is the form of the religion that is practiced in most countries with significant Shia communities. Nevertheless, other much smaller Shia sects exist, such as the Zaydis of Yemen and the Ismailis, who are found in South Asia and in diaspora communities around the world. The origin of the Sunni-Shia split goes back to the early years of Islam. The Prophet Muhammad, in addition to being God's messenger, as Muslims believe, he was also the political leader of the early Muslim community. He died in 632 without a male heir. He had no sons that survived childhood, and he did not designate a successor. The early Muslim community elected one of his closest companions, Abu Bakr, to succeed him. However, there was a smaller dissenting group which believed that succession should come from within the Prophet's family. This group was known as the Shia, and they preferred the leadership of the Prophet's cousin and son-in-law, Ali. Indeed, the word Shia means party, and the term is short for Shiat Ali, which means Ali's party, or the partisans of Ali. According to the Shia, Ali, as the Prophet's rightful successor, was the first imam or leader. And Twelver Shias, who again form the mainstream within Shia Islam, they are called Twelvers because they believe that 11 imams followed Ali for a total of 12. The followers of Abu Bakr, who again, that was most of the early Muslim community, they ultimately became known as Sunnis, which comes from the word sunnah, which means orthodox. But again, and indeed, Sunnis are the orthodox. They are the mainstream within Islam. But again, Sunni Islam is far from monolithic. The word Sunni is best understood as an umbrella term that simply denotes those who are not Shia. The split between Sunnis and Shia became permanent in 680, 50 years after the prophet's death. By this point, a new ruler, Yazid, had usurped authority over the Muslim community. Hussein, son of Ali and the third Shia imam, was intent to lead a rebellion against Yazid, but Yazid's forces massacred Hussein's small army at Karbala in present-day Iraq. Ever since, the martyrdom of Hussein has suffused Shia Islam with an ethos of victimhood and struggle against injustice, as represented by Hussein's fight against Yazid. And indeed, an ethos of mourning for Hussein is distinctive of Shia Islam. The other major theological difference between Sunnis and Shia is that Shia believe that religious authority is vested in the imams. Remember those 12 imams that I briefly mentioned. They believe that religious authority is vested in the imams. And today, the imams' representatives on earth, the ayatollahs, who are found in centers of Shia learning, such as Najaf in Iraq and Qom in Iran. By contrast, for Sunnis, religious authority is based on the Quran and the traditions of the Prophet, and clerics are not seen as intermediaries between believers and God. In general, I don't really like to draw parallels between Sunni and Shia Islam on the one hand, and Catholicism and the Protestant denominations on the other, because the parallels are imperfect at best, and sometimes I think they do more to obscure than to elucidate. But given where we are, given for this group, I will make an attempt to draw a few points of comparison. I was just explaining that Sunnis do not regard their religious leaders as intermediaries between believers and God. By contrast, Shia men of religion are regarded as intermediaries, and they are therefore thought of as a clergy. What's more, the Shia clerical community is very centralized. Although, to be fair, and I will only say this very briefly, the Shia clerical community is at once both very centralized and multipolar, meaning that there are competing actors within the Shia clergy. But so in some, Shiism, at least Twelver Shiism, which again is the mainstream within Shia Islam, Shiism is structured similarly to how the Roman Catholic Church or indeed the Anglican Communion is structured. By contrast, Sunni men of religion function more along the lines of how Protestant ministers do. However, a significant similarity between Shiism and the Protestant denominations is that both essentially began as movements that broke off from the mainstream of the religion. Again, the Shia began as a breakaway faction within the early Muslim community, while of course the Protestant Reformation began as a protest movement against Rome. And I will come back to this point in a few minutes. There we go. Theology aside, what's really important in understanding the relationship between Sunnis and Shia today are the significant demographic imbalances between them. Again, Sunnis form the mainstream within Islam, and indeed the vast majority of Muslims, at about 85%, are Sunnis. Thus, the Shia, who make up almost all the remaining 15%, they really only constitute a small minority of the global religion. Of the approximately 50 Muslim majority countries in the world, only 4 have Shia majorities: Iran, Iraq, Bahrain, and Azerbaijan. By contrast to this pretty significant demographic imbalance within Islam, the numbers of Catholics and Protestants in the world is much more equal. And this imbalance between Sunnis and Shia is even more pronounced in the Arab world. By one estimate, no more than about 11% of Arabs are Shia Muslims, and only 2 of the 22 Arab states have Shia majorities: Iraq and Bahrain. And even in these countries, there are still significant Sunni minorities. Sunnis constitute about 35% of the population of Iraq and about 30% of the population of Bahrain. By contrast, Iran is an overwhelmingly Shia country at about 90 to 95% of the Iranian population. No other country of the Muslim world comes anywhere close to having such a large Shia population, either in absolute numbers or as a proportion of its people, as Iran. There are two important considerations that flow from these demographic imbalances. First, Sunnis possess a profound sense of occupying the majority position within global Islam, and therefore the mainstream of the religion. By contrast, the Shia have typically been regarded by the dominant Sunnis as something of a deviant outgroup. And indeed, Shia Muslims themselves often possess deep feelings of marginalization from the Sunni mainstream. This majority-minority dynamic has played itself out in a theological context, with leading Sunni institutions having frequently balked at recognizing Shiism as a legitimate school of Islam. It's not that most Sunnis are necessarily anti-Shia, just that historically, Sunnis have tended to see the Shia as different and marginal. And this is the point I wanted to come back to. The Roman Catholics, at least in the past, tended to see themselves as the one true church, and tended to see us Protestants as perhaps not totally legitimate. Of course, Protestants historically had all sorts of prejudices towards, the Catholics as well. But, among Catholics, perhaps, there was a tendency to see themselves as, the one true church. There's sort of a similar dynamic how Sunnis, often regard the Shia. However, this dynamic reaches an extreme when it comes to those Sunnis who adhere to a Wahhabi or Salafist interpretation of the Sunni Islamic faith. Wahhabis and Salafists do reject Shia Islam. They tend to see the Shia as not Muslims at all, but rather as heretics, just as the Roman Catholics perhaps viewed Protestants during the Reformation. It's important to point out that historically, Wahhabis and Salafists, those that consider the Shia to be heretics, they have not been mainstream within Sunni Islam, not even close. But in the 20th century, their numbers most definitely became much more significant, primarily because Saudi Arabia began to fund these movements throughout the Islamic world. Historically, the state religion of Saudi Arabia has been Wahhabi Islam, and the Wahhabis have historically been very close to the Saudi ruling elite. But so returning to the dynamics and relations between Sunnis and Shia, the Sunnis have normally been not only theologically dominant, but also politically dominant. Of all the political dynasties that have ruled in Muslim lands since the advent of Islam, only a few have been Shia. And in the Arab lands, all the important political dynasties have been, with one exception, Sunni. That one exception were the Shia Fatimids of Egypt, who ruled Egypt in from the 10th to 12th centuries. The important point here is that in the Arab lands, while Shia may have held power in a few places on a local level, following the 12th century collapse of the Fatimids, virtually all the important centers of power were dominated by Sunnis. Besides the Fatimids, the other really noteworthy Shia political dynasty were the Persian Safavids, who came to power in what is today Iran in 1501. The Safavids forcibly converted the Iranian population to Shiism, which is why Iran today is almost all Shia. And this brings us to a second really important consideration that flows from the demographic imbalances between Sunnis and Shia, namely that most Sunnis associate Shiism with Iran. In the Arab context, a frequent stereotype among Sunni Arabs toward Shia Arabs is that the latter possess a supposed loyalty to Iran. Indeed, Sunni Arabs frequently see their Shia counterparts as basically Iranian agents or even fifth columnists. This is despite the important differences that exist between the Shia of the Arab world and Iran. It is important to point out that Arab and Iranian Shia have different cultures and they speak different languages. Iranians are not Arabs, they are Persian, and their culture really is quite different from that of the Arabs. Moreover, the various Shia communities of the Arab countries and Iran became adherents of Shiism at different times and for different reasons. This is not to say that there aren't important bonds between Arab Shia communities and Iran. There absolutely are. But to lump the Arab Shia into some sort of monolithic Shiism seen as controlled by Iran is to overlook the diversity that exists within Shia Islam and that exists even within its predominant strain of Twelver Shiism. Okay, so Sunnis have usually been on top, particularly in the Arab world. That said, for most of the 20th century, sectarian identity was not something that most Arab Muslims spent a lot of time thinking about. Sunnis and Shia coexisted more or less peacefully, and they often intermarried, particularly in Iraq. Indeed, within the scholarly community, prior to the last 20 years, there was hardly any literature at all about Sunni-Shia relations. Given the banality of the topic and of sectarian identity, this wasn't something that scholars typically studied. So what changed? Why did these sectarian identities and tensions become so inflamed in more recent decades? Scholars speak of three waves of sectarianization, the process by which sectarian identities come to the fore over the last 40 years or so. These waves were triggered by three epoch-making events: the 1979 Iranian Revolution, the 2003 invasion of Iraq, and the Arab uprisings that began at the end of 2010. And I will briefly address all three. Prior to the Iranian Revolution, Iran under the Pahlavi Shahs, who ruled Iran for much of the 20th century, they projected a secular image. The Pahlavis of Iran downplayed religion entirely, and they promoted Persian nationalism. The last Pahlavi Shah was swept away in the revolution of 1979, and the regime that followed, the Islamic Republic, was a Shia theocracy, dominated in the first decade by Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. Khomeini and his followers believed that their revolution was not for Iran alone, but for all Muslims and indeed for all the world. Within Iran, the language and the symbols they deployed were those of Shia Islam. But outside Iran, their discourse was more ecumenical in order to appeal to the Sunni mainstream. While many Sunni Islamists were initially impressed by Khomeini, the Muslims of the Arab world who really rallied to the revolution were Shia Islamists from places like Iraq, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, and Lebanon. Most of Iran's Arab neighbors felt deeply threatened by the Iranian Revolution, which of course the Iranians were claiming was universal. To contain revolutionary Iran, Iraq under Saddam Hussein invaded its neighbor, invaded Iran, which led to a disastrous 8-year war. At the same time, Saudi Arabia, for its part, also felt deeply threatened. The Saudis became a key ally of Iraq in the Iran-Iraq War, and they also unleashed Saudi Arabia's Wahhabi religious establishment to produce a spate of writings and audio recordings denouncing Khomeini and the Iranians, and indeed Shia Islam, in the most lurid of terms. Again, Wahhabis are among the few Sunni Muslims who really do view the Shia as infidels. So in the 1980s, as a result of the revolution in Iran, as well as the Saudi Wahhabi response to it, sectarian identity became inflamed in the Arab world, really for the first time in the 20th century. It's also important to point out that the revolution caused Arab political elites, who were virtually all Sunnis at that point, to view Arab Shia communities with suspicion. Again, it was a historic prejudice among Arab Sunnis that Arab Shia were somehow loyal to Iran, but that prejudice was reduced while the secular Pahlavi Shahs were in power in Iran. Once a Shia theocracy replaced the Pahlavis, that historic suspicion toward the Arab Shia among Arab Sunnis, that historic suspicion was revived. This first wave of sectarianization receded with the end of the Iran-Iraq War at the end of the 1980s and the death of Ayatollah Khomeini at about the same time. Nevertheless, it set the stage for what followed. And what followed, the 2003 US invasion of Iraq, was truly a momentous event in the evolution of Sunni-Shia relations. As a result of the invasion, the new Iraq that emerged had a government that was led by Shia. And this, of course, was the doing of the United States and George W. Bush. It's not that the Bush administration was looking to empower the Iraqi Shia as such, but one of the rationales for the invasion, besides uncovering Saddam Hussein's supposed weapons of mass destruction, one of the rationales was to promote democracy. To do that, the US dismantled Iraq's previous regime, which had been dominated by members of the country's Sunni Arab minority, and established a system in which the country's long repressed Shia majority could assert itself. But this was such a strange occurrence from the Arab point of view, or at least the Sunni Arab point of view, that one scholar, Fanar Haddad, has called 2003 a Copernican moment. Copernicus was the Renaissance man who formulated a new model of the universe in which the sun did not revolve around the earth, but the earth around the sun. Haddad has called 2003 a Copernican moment in that he says the Arab world was forcefully confronted with a political landscape that revolved around Shia, not Sunnis. This was exceedingly strange, as strange for the Arabs in 2003 as Copernicus's model of the universe had been for his contemporaries. In the 20th century, virtually all the Arab states that had been formed out of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire at the end of World War I had been led by Sunnis. And again, no major Arab capital had seen Shia power since the Shia Fatimids of the 12th century. This monumental shift in the balance of power between Sunnis and Shia lay at the heart of Iraq's sectarian civil war in the mid-2000s, not supposedly ancient hatreds between them, as was frequently asserted in the Western media during that time. The sectarian civil war was effectively a confrontation between Shia, who were determined to seize the historical opportunity presented by the 2003 invasion to establish a new state where the Shia would be on top, and Sunnis who wanted things to go back to the way they had always been. The confrontation was effectively a struggle for power amidst the backdrop of the complete collapse of order created by the US invasion. Iraq itself began to stabilize in 2008, but its civil war of the mid-2000s deeply inflamed sectarian identity across the Arab world, and that second wave of sectarianization set the stage for what followed next, the Arab Spring, and particularly the Syrian civil war. The uprising in Syria began as a non-sectarian democratic movement, but it quickly became sectarianized. Indeed, Syria has been called a perfect storm of sectarianization, with top-down and bottom-up forces driving this process against the backdrop of the complete collapse of the Syrian state across much of the country, producing the chaos and fear that always exacerbate sectarianism. Outside actors, such as the Saudis and Iranians, sought to use the uprising to advance their own agendas, and they used sectarian language to denounce each other. Excuse me. And they also backed sectarian groups on the ground to fight on their behalf. Meanwhile, sectarian groups, often exceedingly extremist ones, who had themselves been radicalized by the civil war in Iraq in the mid-2000s, they streamed into Syria to fight in the war. The civil war in Syria threw its next door neighbor back into conflict, culminating in the takeover by the Islamic State, or ISIS, the most extreme of Sunni actors, of 1/3 of Iraq in June 2014. So in sum, by 2014, Sunni and Shia identity had become deeply inflamed. But again, and this is really important to emphasize, this inflammation of sectarian passions was not the result of so-called ancient or perpetual hatreds between Sunnis and Shia, but of these momentous regional events that created waves of sectarianization. The 1979 Iranian Revolution, the 2003 invasion of Iraq, and the Arab Spring leading to the Syrian civil war. Absolutely. And it's also sort of an intergroup conflict. It's exacerbated by, absolutely, by sectarian identity, but they also are sort of different groups culturally. The Shia of Bahrain were sort of the original dwellers of Bahrain. They see themselves as sort of the historic kind of dwellers of Bahrain, and the Sunni ruling family, they're sort of a tribal family. They're all these sort of tribal forces that came into the Gulf in the 18th century. So they sort of have different, and they're sort of more of a tribal group. So in Bahrain, it's, what is also a sectarian kind of dynamic is also just a cultural kind of different groups. And we can, but Iraq also, but today, Bahrain is the one country in the Arab world where there is a Shia majority within Sunni monarchy. But it was the same under Iraq before 2003. It wasn't a monarchy, but it was a Sunni autocrat. Iraq had a Shia majority and a Sunni autocrat. But so I'll just be wrapping up, and then I'm going to open it up to questions. Fortunately, I can wrap up this talk on a much more positive note. Yeah, I know, because I know that much of this is, not uplifting, but this is my final point for you all, and it is a little bit more positive. Just as waves come crashing onto the shore, they also recede. And that is the dynamic of a wave. And we all know that after the COVID pandemic, cases would rise and then they would fall. The norm in the Middle East has always been banal, peaceful coexistence between Sunnis and Shia, and indeed among all the religions that one finds there. And of course, the truth is that there are many religions that one finds with deep roots in the Middle East. Today, we are witnessing a reversion to the norm, to coexistence. Especially in Iraq, which is the Arab country that I know best at this point, the most recent waves of sectarianization associated with the 2003 invasion, the Syrian civil war, and the rise of ISIS, these waves of sectarianization have receded substantially. Whereas for much of the last 20 years, Iraq was almost synonymous with sectarianism, Iraqi Sunnis and Shia today interact fairly normally, even if their grievances have not entirely gone away and probably will never entirely go away. But in contrast to before, Iraqi Sunnis have, for the most part, accepted the new status quo. Iraq has a Shia-dominated political system, and Iraqi Shia have, for the most part, accepted that the Iraqi Sunnis constitute a critical political partner in the Iraqi political system. Iraq today is at peace. It's important to emphasize that, but that's not to say that everything in Iraq, is rosy. It is not. The political system that has developed there in the last 20 years is, quite frankly, very corrupt in an economic sense. And the challenge today, and it's a very significant challenge, is to reform, the corrupt system. However, the important point, and I'm using Iraq as proof of it, is that Sunnis and Shia do not simply hate each other, and they are not perpetually at war. And let me repeat that. Sunnis and Shia do not simply hate each other, and they are not perpetually at war. The Sunni-Shia conflict that broke out in the wake of the 2003 invasion was a result of a particular set of circumstances: the empowerment by the United States of the long repressed Shia majority amidst the backdrop of complete state collapse. As actors in Iraq have become more accustomed to Iraq's new internal balance of power, the sectarian passions that were unleashed by the US intervention have receded substantially. So with that, I will wrap up my talk. We discussed the considerable demographic imbalances between Sunni and Shia Islam. Sunnis constitute the overwhelming majority of Muslims. They tend to view themselves as the mainstream within Islam and also to associate Shiism with Iran. We also talked about the waves of sectarianization that have swept the Middle East in the last 40 years. Inflamed sectarian identity is not the result of perpetual hatreds between Sunnis and Shia, but the result of specific events that have rocked the region in recent decades. And finally, I explained that the norm in the Middle East has typically been peaceful coexistence between Sunnis and Shia. And fortunately, we are witnessing a reversion to the norm today. I hope you feel that you have learned something this morning, and I welcome your questions. Thank you. Absolutely. And so I think the question here was just sort of the unique case that is Bahrain. So prior to 2003, prior to the 2003 invasion of Iraq, there were two countries in the Arab world that had a Shia majority with a Sunni Arab regime, effectively. Iraq, under Saddam Hussein and his predecessors, and Bahrain, which has a population that is about 70% Shia, and the ruling family is Sunni. And so today, after the 2003 invasion of Iraq, Bahrain is the only country, the only Arab country that has a Shia majority with a Sunni ruling elite. And I was saying kind of briefly, and I'll kind of just say it again, perhaps elaborate a little bit. Not only is it a difference in religion, but these are sort of two different groups that sort of see themselves as different groups. The Shia of Bahrain, they see themselves as the original inhabitants of Bahrain. And they see the Sunni ruling family as sort of newcomers to Bahrain. And the fact is that the Sunni ruling family, the Sunni ruling elite in Bahrain, they are newcomers, relatively speaking. Yeah. From the Shia perspective, kind of usurpers. In the 18th century, starting in the 18th century, various sort of tribal, kind of more nomadic, kind of Bedouin tribes from kind of Central Arabia migrated to the Gulf, to the Persian Gulf coast, and those members of that sort of migration are now in power in Bahrain, but also in the United Arab Emirates and in Qatar and in Kuwait. And so the ruling family in Bahrain was part of that 18th century migration. So they are newcomers, at least from the we don't think of 18th century as sort of newcomers, but from the perspective of the Bahraini Shia, who see themselves as the original inhabitants, they are sort of newcomers. So so it's not only Sunni Shia religion, it's also kind of these different groups with different cultural ethos. There is sort of historically in the Middle East and the Arab world, there's sort of a big cultural difference between kind of settled communities and Bedouin. That is a big kind of cultural divide. And so that is also kind of wrapped up in this kind of divide between, the original inhabitants were Shia and settled communities, and the royal family who were Sunni and kind of the tribal Bedouin. And I would say also, and this goes back to kind of these waves of sectarianization that I mentioned. This was always in the 20th century. This was always sort of a flashpoint in Bahrain, but it became more of a flashpoint after the revolution in Iran, because again, Iran under the Pahlavis were secular. So they weren't the Iranian, powers that be. They might have sort of attempted to intervene in the various different countries of the region, but they didn't really intervene in sort of a religious sense. They weren't kind of playing on those religious ties because they were secular. That wasn't sort of the card that they played. With the rise 44 years ago of a Shia theocracy in Iran, this made kind of Sunni ruling elites in the Gulf much more suspicious towards Shia communities of the Gulf from a religious angle, because now they're the ruling elites in Iran are are religious and do kind of intervene in sort of that way, or there is at least a suspicion that Iran attempts to intervene in that way. So Bahrain remains sort of a unique case. And I suppose a big difference between Islam and Christianity is that within Islam, the religious leader was always considered the political leader. Muhammad was both, a leader in a religious sense and political leader of the community. And so, so there isn't sort of the natural separation of church and state or mosque and state that, that has been sort of more part of kind of Western culture. And quite frankly, I mentioned a little bit of the differences between Sunni and Shia sort of men of religion. And they are called men of religion. I mean, there are no women of religion. In Sunni countries, the men of religion are literally employees of the state. It's a little different in Shia Islam, but in Sunni countries, Sunni men of religion are literally employees of the state, and that's where they get their salary. And so there isn't quite the separation that we, at least in the United States, certainly kind of take for granted. So I think that certainly in the context of Iran, what was Khomeini actually absolutely had sort of a new Shia interpretation. But actually his interpretation was that Shia, that the ultimate authority within the state should be a Shia religious scholar, a Shia jurisprudential scholar. And this was in the context of Iran. Starting in the early 20th century, there had been a kind of struggle between the Shia religious establishment and the powers that be. And under the Pahlavis, who were secular, the religious establishment had really been very sidelined and marginalized. That at least was by the Pahlavis, was to marginalize the religious establishment. And that created this sort of backlash whereby the religious establishment and Khomeini attempted and successfully succeeded in seizing power. And that's, and we, of course, Iran today still has what is very much a theocracy. But so a lot of, but to kind of also get to your point, what we consider kind of struggles, conflicts, between Sunnis and Shia, sort of religious conflicts, they're really struggles for power as opposed to sort of, they are not, religious language might be used and religious rhetoric might be used, but they're not really fighting over theology. What they're fighting over is power. Long story, very short. I have, so Iraq is the country that I now focus on most significantly. I have now made contact with the one Anglican church in Iraq, which is in Baghdad. It is called St. George's Anglican Episcopal Church. And if you can believe it, I was in Baghdad in March, and I met the rector and his assistant, and not only attended services at St. George's, but visited a clinic and a nursery and elementary school that they run. And if you can believe it, timing is everything. Father Fayez, the rector, and his assistant Sinan happen to be coming to the United States in May this month, and they will be in Washington, D.C. and in New York. And we are here at St. Thomas. We are planning on putting an event together on May 23rd. You will receive an invitation. It will be evensong, and the reception will take place after evensong. But to welcome Father Fayez and Sinan, and the Pennsylvania-based Episcopal charity that's sponsoring them, Stand with Iraqi Christians. And so we're going to be hearing about what is important to them. They have been very instrumental in helping Christian refugees of ISIS. And so we will hear what's important and their challenges. And I hope that you'll all be able to attend, or many of you. Thank you very much.